Rain tapped against the dark glass of a Beirut apartment, and somewhere beyond the harbor, a ship waited, with its lights dimmed, like a patient predator. Inside, a British gentleman sat very still, with a glass in his hand, knowing that one wrong knock on the door could end not only his life as a spy, but the lie he had spent 3 decades perfecting. Welcome back, listeners. Today, we delve into the shadows to uncover the story of Kim Philby, the MI6 mole who betrayed Britain to the KGB, a man who wore loyalty like a tailored suit, who spoke with the ease of an English patriot, and who quietly fed an empire of secrets to the enemy while standing in the very heart of British intelligence. If you want to understand Philby, you cannot begin with the man alone. You have to begin with the century that made him possible. You have to step back into a Europe of broken promises, bitter ideologies, and men who believed history was not simply unfolding before them, but calling them to take sides. The first half of the 20th century was not merely violent, it was suffocating. It pressed down upon the lungs. It turned universities into recruiting grounds, newspapers into weapons, diplomacy into theater, and private conscience into a battlefield more dangerous than any trench. Britain, in those years, still carried itself with the posture of empire. The accent was confident, the clubs were warm. The public schools kept producing the kind of men who were expected to govern others as naturally as they tied a necktie. There was a faith, almost religious in its certainty, that the right family, the right education, and the right manner were themselves proof of character. If a man sounded correct, dressed correctly, and knew the rules of the game, many assumed he was one of the trustworthy custodians of the realm. But across Europe, the old world was cracking. The Great War had not simply ended one conflict, it had poisoned the peace that followed. Economies convulsed, democracies trembled. Fascism marched beneath banners and torchlight. Communism, for others, appeared not as a menace, but as a hard and necessary answer to the decay of the old order. Young men at Cambridge, Oxford, Vienna, Berlin, and Paris were not arguing over abstractions. They were asking whether capitalism had failed, whether fascism must be crushed before it consumed Europe, whether loyalty to one's nation mattered less than loyalty to an idea. That is how the century seduced them. Not with money, not at first, and not always with blackmail. It seduced them with moral urgency. It whispered that neutrality was cowardice, that the old loyalties were rotting, that true virtue lay not in preserving the present, but in helping history arrive faster. Kim Philby was born Harold Adrian Russell Philby in 1912 in British India, into a life that from the outside seemed almost designed to produce imperial confidence. Even the nickname by which the world would know him, Kim, carried the shadow of Kipling and empire with it. His father was not an ordinary man and did not live an ordinary life. John Philby was a scholar, explorer, official, and adventurer, brilliant and eccentric, a man as likely to admire the Arab desert as the machinery of London power. In that household, intelligence was expected, independence was admired, emotional warmth was less certain. Try to picture the young Philby, not yet the legendary deceiver, not yet the smiling traitor, just a boy growing up under the long silhouette of an extraordinary father, learning very early that charm could conceal reserve, that intellect could win admiration, and that identity itself might be more flexible than most people imagined. Such boys often learn an important lesson before adulthood. They learn that the self presented to the world is not always the self held within. For an ordinary man, that lesson may become social polish. For a future spy, it can become a way of life. At Westminster and then at Trinity College, Cambridge, Philby entered the bloodstream of the British elite. Cambridge in those years was not merely a place of study. It was a furnace of conviction. The old establishment still recruited there, quietly and efficiently, seeking clever young men who could be shaped into diplomats, civil servants, and intelligence officers. But revolutionary ideas were also alive in those rooms, in late conversations, in smoke-filled corners, in discussions that wandered from economics to justice to the future of Europe. For some students, communism was a distant theory. For others, it felt like a moral summons. Philby was one of those who listened. There is something chilling about the early stages of ideological conversion because they rarely look dramatic. No thunder, no secret oath in a cellar lit by candles. It often begins with sympathy, then admiration, then rationalization. Then, one day, a line has been crossed, and the person who crossed it tells himself that he has not betrayed anything worth saving. In the early 1930s, Philby moved through a Europe where the stakes were rising by the month. He spent time in Vienna, and Vienna was no place for the politically sleepy. It was a city of tension, poverty, class anger, and impending repression. In that atmosphere, he encountered committed communists, among them Litzy Friedman, an Austrian leftist who was intelligent, forceful, and already part of circles far more dangerous than they looked from the outside. The relationship was emotional, political, and practical all at once. Their marriage helped her escape danger. It also drew Philby deeper into underground networks, into a world where discretion mattered, where names could be false, and where cause and secrecy began to merge. This was not yet the polished MI6 officer in a good suit. This was the apprenticeship of concealment, courier work, quiet meetings, observing who could be trusted, learning that the true strength of a covert life lies in making extraordinary behavior appear ordinary. Every clandestine career begins with such lessons. A message passed in a park, a contact reached through another, a political commitment tested through risk. You learn how to speak less than you know. You learn how to appear unremarkable while the ground beneath you shifts. At some point in 1934, Soviet intelligence recruited him. However one imagines the precise moment, whether the handler was soft-spoken or severe, whether the request was direct or carefully staged, the meaning was the same. A young Englishman of talent had chosen his side. And the brilliance of the Soviet method, especially with men like Philby, lay in this. They did not ask him to become a caricature of a revolutionary. They asked him to do the opposite. Hide it, bury it, become more English, more acceptable, more reassuring than ever. Cast off the obvious signs of left-wing commitment. Let the establishment trust you. Let them invite you in. That instruction was the key to everything that followed. A mediocre conspirator flaunts his radicalism. A great penetration agent abandons it in public and makes his mask indistinguishable from his face. Philby understood the assignment with terrifying completeness. The 1930s rolled onward, and the shadows lengthened over Europe. Spain erupted into civil war, which was never merely a Spanish matter. It became a rehearsal hall for the coming world catastrophe, a test of ideologies in blood. Fascists, monarchists, republicans, communists, idealists, opportunists, and foreign powers all gathered around the corpse of a nation struggling to remain alive. Journalists arrived too, because war creates both headlines and cover. Philby went to Spain as a correspondent. On the surface, this was adventurous work. Dangerous, yes, but respectable. Journalists moved near armies, spoke to officers, watched the war unfold. Yet for a man in Philby's position, journalism offered much more. Access, mobility, plausible curiosity, the ability to ask questions without seeming to interrogate, the ability to travel without looking like a courier, the ability to stand close to power while pretending merely to observe it. And perhaps here, listeners, we should pause and dwell on one of the great paradoxes of espionage. The most valuable cover is often not one that hides you from the world, but one that places you squarely in front of it. A correspondent, a diplomat, a businessman, a cultural attaché, a scholar. These are not shadows, they are recognized presences. Their visibility becomes their concealment. Nobody asks why the journalist wants to know what the general thinks. Nobody questions why the diplomat attends receptions. The role answers the suspicion before it forms. In Spain, Philby learned to inhabit this principle. He cultivated the image needed for his future. Conservative enough to reassure the British right. Cool enough under fire to impress those who admired courage. Useful enough to be remembered. He even won distinction from Franco's side, an irony so sharp it almost feels fictional. Yet history is often crueler than fiction because it does not need plausibility. It only needs opportunity. The more convincing Philby became as a man of the establishment, the more attractive he was to British intelligence. And British intelligence at that time remained deeply vulnerable to the habits of class. Background was currency. Accent was armor. Recommendation was almost a sacrament. If the right people vouched for you, doors opened. This was not stupidity exactly. It was cultural blindness. A system built on old trust could not easily imagine that one of its own had long ago transferred his allegiance to a foreign power. War came at last with all the inevitability of a gathering storm that polite society keeps pretending might turn aside. Europe descended into catastrophe. Cities burned. Armies crashed into one another. Governments lied, improvised, panicked. Intelligence services expanded rapidly because modern war demanded not only men and machines, but foreknowledge. Where would the enemy strike? Which government might fall? Which courier could be turned? Which code could be broken? Which rumor concealed a truth? Philby entered British intelligence during this period. The route was not unusual for the time. Personal connections mattered. War accelerated careers. Need overrode caution. Once inside, he proved what had always made him dangerous. He was not merely deceptive, he was capable. Competence is the force multiplier of betrayal. A fool can leak secrets. A talented traitor reshapes entire institutions because his superiors want to reward him, protect him, and trust him with more. By the early 1940s, Philby was working in Section 5 of MI6, the branch concerned with counterintelligence and anti-Soviet matters in parts of Europe. Let that sink in. A Soviet agent had entered the British machinery, designed, among other things, to monitor and counter hostile intelligence. The irony was not poetic, it was lethal. For every file Philby read, every conversation he joined, every assessment he signed, Moscow gained not only information, but insight into how Britain thought. That is the highest prize in espionage. Not a single secret, but the enemy's habits of mind. And Philby kept rising. People later asked how it was possible. How could nobody see him? How could so many intelligent men miss what was in front of them? But this question, though understandable, gives too much credit to institutions and too little to performance. Philby was admired. He appeared disciplined, urbane, self-controlled. He knew how to speak in the codes of his class. He knew when to be modest, when to be decisive, when to seem burdened by duty rather than hungry for advancement. He did not present himself as a flamboyant mastermind. He was something more believable and therefore more dangerous. He presented himself as a dependable Englishman doing a difficult job well. There is also the private strain to consider. Imagine the daily pressure of living two lives, and then remember that for some people, pressure is not only endured, but converted into pleasure. The risk becomes part of the identity. The narrow escape becomes proof of superiority. Every secret safely passed, every suspicion deflected, every promotion earned under false colors becomes a narcotic. A man begins by serving an ideology. He may continue because he has grown addicted to the game. Philby's domestic life offered no refuge from this darkness. He married, fathered children, moved through the routines of respectable adulthood. Yet the ordinary life of a spy is always built over hidden chambers. The family dinner, the office conversation, the train journey home. All may conceal another track beneath them. And the deepest cruelty of espionage is this. The people closest to the spy often live inside a theater they did not know they entered. Wives, children, friends, colleagues. Their affection becomes camouflage. Their faith becomes an operational asset. The spy may love them in some complicated and damaged way, but he uses the normalcy they create as part of his shield. The war ended, but the peace that followed was thin and brittle. The alliance against Hitler dissolved into the cold hostility of a new age. The Soviet Union, once an ally of necessity, became the West's great adversary. Intelligence services did not relax. They hardened. Networks were expanded. Defectors were cultivated. Fronts multiplied. Everyone expected the next conflict to emerge not only through armies, but through secrets, subversion, sabotage, and the silent war of agents and double agents. For Philby, this new age was not a danger. It was an opportunity beyond the dreams of his recruiters. In a Cold War world, an anti-Soviet specialist inside British intelligence became priceless to Moscow. He was promoted again, moving into positions of immense sensitivity. By the late 1940s, he was serving in Washington as the chief MI6 liaison with American intelligence, working closely with the emerging architecture of Anglo-American secret cooperation. Now the scale of the betrayal widened dramatically. This was no longer a matter of passing along isolated memoranda. Philby stood at one of the great junction points of Western intelligence. Britain and the United States were sharing assessments, plans, anxieties, and covert ambitions. Anti-communist operations were being conceived. Networks were being tested. Small nations became chessboards. One such theater was Albania, where Western planners hoped to send in anti-communist infiltrators. On paper, it looked daring. In practice, it became a tragedy. The Soviets learned far too much too early. Men sent into danger walked into prepared nets. Some were captured, some were killed. Behind the failure lay many causes, as failures usually do. But Philby's hand, whether direct in every detail or devastating in broader warning, darkened the operation all the same. Try to imagine the human cost, not as a statistic, but as separate endings. A man stepping off a boat at night, believing he had a chance. A whispered password, a hill path, a farmhouse, then headlights, then gunfire, then prison, then years erased inside a cell or a body in an unmarked place. That is what betrayal by a mole means in the real world. Not merely strategic disadvantage, it means living people move according to secret assurances that have already been sold. And still, he survived. The great protection around Philby was not only his skill, but the disbelief of others. It is hard for institutions to accuse their own golden men. Harder still when the accusation implicates the judgment of senior officers who trusted him, promoted him, drank with him, laughed with him, perhaps even loved him in the dry and unsentimental way British men of that class often loved one another. To expose Philby would mean admitting not only that one man had betrayed Britain, but that Britain's guardians had been fooled for years at the highest levels. Then came one of the most haunting episodes in the entire saga, an episode that reveals how espionage can turn on a single message and a few hours' delay. In 1945, a Soviet diplomat and intelligence officer in Istanbul, Konstantin Volkov, approached the British and offered to defect. He was not bringing gossip. He was offering something explosive: names, networks, penetrations. Among the Soviet agents inside Britain's own apparatus, he hinted, was a man in a highly sensitive counterintelligence post. It was the sort of revelation that can make careers, collapse networks, and change the course of a hidden war. For British intelligence, handled correctly, it could have been a thunderbolt. For Philby, it was the sound of a trap closing. Now listen carefully to how perilous the life of a mole becomes at such a moment. There are many dangers in espionage, but none more terrifying than the unexpected defector who knows enough to identify you. A code can hold. A courier can remain silent. A file can stay buried. But a frightened insider with a conscience, or greed, or both, can suddenly put your name within reach of the men you have deceived for years. At that point, survival depends on time, minutes, hours, the ability to get ahead of the revelation. Philby learned of Volkov's approach through British channels. The wolf had smelled the hunter. And because Philby himself was in precisely the kind of position Volkov intended to expose, he was able to do the one thing no intelligence service ever wants a mole to be able to do. He took control of the response. This is where the story becomes almost unbearable in its coldness. Philby alerted Moscow. He then maneuvered to be centrally involved in handling the case. The British did not yet understand they were asking the condemned man to investigate the witness against him. By the time action reached Istanbul in earnest, it was too late. Volkov and his wife vanished into Soviet custody. Reports later suggested a grim removal, drugged, bandaged, carried away before they could speak freely. They were never seen again. Think of the silence after that. A consulate room emptied of hope. A delayed flight. A report filed too late. Somewhere in that gap between what might have happened and what did happen lies the true anatomy of espionage failure. Not always a dramatic battle. Sometimes only a delay, a misplaced confidence, an unseen hand guiding the file into the wrong pile until the chance is dead. For Philby, it was a victory of the darkest kind. He had not merely evaded exposure, he had helped erase the man who could have ended him. Little did his colleagues know that the polite, composed officer across the desk was not only reporting on the crisis, but had already decided its outcome. Yet a life like this cannot remain perfectly balanced forever. Suspicion, once born, may sleep for years, but it does not always die. The first great tremor came with two other men bound to Philby by university ties, ideology, and mutual danger. Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean were part of the same larger constellation of Soviet penetration. MacLean, in particular, had access to extremely sensitive diplomatic and strategic material. By the early 1950s, British and American investigators were tightening the noose around him. The pressure intensified. Every intelligence officer dreads that stage of an inquiry, when vague concern hardens into targeted suspicion. Then every friendship becomes a liability. Every call matters. Every odd movement can be remembered later as evidence. Philby again found himself at the center of danger. If MacLean fell cleanly into British hands, what might he reveal? If Burgess panicked, how much damage would he do? Soviet networks often look disciplined from a distance, but under threat they can become desperate and improvised. Personal weakness, alcohol, vanity, fear, all the ordinary frailties of human beings begin to seep into the secret world. Warnings were passed, signals were arranged. Burgess and MacLean fled to Moscow in 1951. Their disappearance detonated across Britain and America like a charge placed beneath the foundations of trust. The question was immediate and merciless. Who had warned them? The answer, though not publicly proven, drifted toward Philby like smoke. He had been close to Burgess, too close, some thought. Their associations were awkward. Their timing was unfortunate. The old certainty around Philby began to crack, not fully, not enough, but enough to chill the rooms he entered. And here, listeners, the cat-and-mouse game enters its most exquisite phase. This is not yet the final pursuit. This is the long period of partial suspicion, of sidelong glances and unfinished cases, of a man trying to look calm while wondering which conversation may destroy him. It is, in some ways, more psychologically brutal than arrest. An arrest ends uncertainty. Suspicion prolongs it. Philby was questioned. Files were reviewed. Allegations floated. He was removed from some duties. But no definitive proof was found, or at least not enough proof for the standard demanded by those who still wanted to believe in him. Remember, intelligence services are not only machines of detection, they are communities of ego. To expose Philby would implicate everyone who had shielded him. That creates hesitation. Hesitation is the oxygen of a mole's survival. He resigned from MI6. Outwardly, it looked like a fall. Inwardly, it may have felt like a reprieve mixed with dread. A spy without official position is still vulnerable. He loses access. He may lose relevance to his handlers. He also loses part of his protective aura. Yet Philby did what he had always done. He adapted. Publicly, he maintained composure. Privately, one imagines the calculations growing more frantic. Could he rebuild? Had the worst passed? Was he living on borrowed time? Then came one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of British public life. In 1955, after accusations had swirled and the press had begun to chase the scent of the so-called third man, the British government effectively cleared him. He appeared before journalists and denied ever having been a communist. Calmly, smoothly, as if the entire thing were a regrettable misunderstanding. What must that have felt like, to stand there and tell such a lie while cameras clicked and the world listened? To know that behind the measured voice was a secret archive of betrayals. To watch officials, ministers, colleagues, and reporters weigh your words and, in many cases, accept them. It was not merely evasion. It was a performance of innocence on a national stage, and for the moment, it worked. This, perhaps, was the height of Philby's mastery. Not the passing of a file, not the recruitment in youth, not even the escape of others. It was the ability to absorb suspicion and turn it back into respectability, to make doubt itself look ungentlemanly. to exploit the manners of his country as a defensive weapon. He later resurfaced in Beirut as a journalist, writing for major British publications while also renewing his connection to MI6 in a looser capacity. Beirut suited the age. It was cosmopolitan, strategic, beautiful, and unstable. Diplomats, reporters, businessmen, agents, and adventurers all moved through its hotels, bars, embassies, and drawing rooms. A man could disappear there in plain sight. A correspondent asking questions at lunch might be sending another kind of report by nightfall. A walk by the sea could become surveillance. A dinner invitation could conceal an assessment meeting. In such cities, the Cold War felt almost theatrical, except the consequences were real. And so Philby settled into another layer of cover, another precarious calm. The sea glittered, the parties continued, the bottles emptied, friends came and went. Yet beneath the surface, pressure was building again. Defectors from the Soviet side were speaking, old names resurfaced. Fragments from the past refused to stay buried. The years had not washed the danger away. They had only spread it thin, like poison in a deeper well. Imagine him there at dusk, perhaps on a balcony above the city, hearing the horns below, feeling the Mediterranean breeze, perhaps convincing himself that he had outlived the worst. But men like Philby never truly relax. The practiced smile may return, the handshake may remain steady, yet somewhere within, the mind keeps measuring exits, memorizing timings, listening for the tone in a friend's voice that means the conversation is no longer friendly. Because in espionage, the most dangerous moment is often not when the hunter first suspects you. It is when he finally knows enough to come close, and still approaches with civility. By the early 1960s, that moment was drawing near. More pieces had fallen into place. Those who had defended Philby most stubbornly were finding the ground harder to hold. The old confidence was decaying. His drinking grew worse. The strain, once hidden so elegantly, began to show in cracks. There are stories from this period of a man less perfectly composed, less armored than before, as if the decades of performance were finally extracting their debt. But perhaps the deepest terror for Philby was not simply exposure, it was recognition. The possibility that the man arriving to confront him would not be a faceless investigator, but an old friend, someone who knew his voice, his habits, his manner of deflecting. Someone who had once trusted him enough to overlook what now seemed obvious. In such a meeting, the game becomes intimate. It is no longer Britain versus traitor, or East versus West. It is man against man, memory against evidence, friendship against the unbearable truth. And that is where we must leave him for now. Not in Moscow yet, not vanished into legend, not fully unmasked before the world. We leave Kim Philby in Beirut, in that narrowing corridor between suspicion and doom, with the tide moving somewhere below the city and the final reckoning stepping softly toward his door. He has lied to governments, betrayed comrades, condemned agents, and survived what should have destroyed him. But survival has its own cost, and the mask he wore so long is beginning to slip. Somewhere in the night, a ship waits. Somewhere else, an old friend is coming with questions that can no longer be postponed. And Philby, perhaps for the first time in many years, can feel the shadows closing in around one of their own. The end began, as such endings often do, not with a gunshot, but with a conversation between men who knew each other too well. By late 1962 and early 1963, the air around Kim Philby had changed. The old protection was thinning. New Soviet defections had revived old suspicions. Fragments that had once seemed scattered now began to form a pattern. Not a perfect pattern, not one that satisfied every legal requirement, not the sort of evidence a courtroom might embrace with ease, but enough to make denial feel tired and belief feel costly. The years had carried him far, but not far enough to outrun memory. Some lies decay slowly. They lose their polish. The edges begin to show. In Beirut, Philby was no longer standing on the broad, bright platform of the British establishment. He was living in a narrower world now, one of correspondence lunches, embassy gossip, old friendships, alcohol, and private messages that still moved through hidden channels. The city around him remained lovely in the deceptive way certain cities do before history wounds them openly. The sea still flashed under sunlight. The evenings still carried perfume, tobacco, and the low murmur of multiple languages drifting through hotel bars. Men in linen jackets discussed politics as if it were sport. Women laughed behind cigarette smoke. Cars glided along the corniche. But for Philby, beauty had become a fragile stage set. Behind the curtains, the machinery of reckoning had begun to move. When Nicholas Elliot arrived, he did not come as a stranger. That was the cruelty of it. He came as a friend from the older world. A man of the same class, the same service, the same habits of speech. One of the most agonizing elements in the Philby story is that the final unmasking did not come through some faceless bureaucrat pushing papers across a desk. It came through intimacy, through shared memory, through the knowledge of what one man had once meant to another. There is a special terror in being confronted by someone who knows not only the facts of your life, but the tone of your voice when you are lying. Such a person does not need theatrical evidence. He studies pauses. He hears what is missing. He remembers who you used to be, or who you claim to be, and measures the distance between that memory and the creature sitting before him now. Accounts of the confrontation vary in texture, as all intelligent stories do. The secret world leaves behind fragments, memoirs, official accounts, omissions, wounded recollections, and myths that gather around the known facts like fog around harbor lights. But the essential truth is firm. Elliot confronted Philby in Beirut with the knowledge that the game was up, or near enough to it that only a fool could pretend otherwise. Philby, by then drinking heavily and living under immense internal strain, no longer possessed the effortless balance that had carried him through earlier crises. He was exhausted. The mind that had once danced around suspicion now had to face the possibility that there was no graceful step left. Imagine that room for a moment. Not as a stage drama, but as a weary chamber of truth and performance intertwined. One man looking at an old friend with disgust, disbelief, and perhaps a residue of affection he wished he did not feel. The other forced to calculate whether confession might save him, whether partial admission might buy time, whether one more elegant evasion might still hold. Outside, Beirut moved on. Traffic, voices, the sea. Inside, decades of deception were collapsing into a handful of sentences. Philby admitted enough. Not necessarily everything, and certainly not with the clean moral clarity of a repentant man. Spies rarely confess as priests do. They bargain even in truth. They reduce, reshape, conceal within disclosure. Yet enough was said to cross a fatal line. Enough for Elliot to know that the beloved colleague had indeed been the betrayer. Enough for Philby to understand that the old denials could no longer restore what had been lost. But then comes one of the most troubling possibilities in the whole affair. Was the confrontation itself already too late to secure him? Had friendship delayed action? Had the British hoped to coax a fuller written confession rather than seize him at once? Was there still some residual reluctance, some unwillingness to drag one of their own into public ruin before the last possible moment? Intelligence history is often littered with disasters caused by hesitation, wearing the face of decency. You can almost hear the thoughts of the officials involved. Let us manage this quietly. Let us not create a scandal prematurely. Let us see what more he will say. Let us preserve what can be preserved. But espionage is merciless toward hesitation. The man you gently question today may be gone by nightfall. Philby asked for time. Time to consider. Time to prepare a fuller statement. Time, that precious substance without which no fugitive can escape and no service can rescue its asset. Every extra hour in Beirut was an opening. Every assumption that he would remain cooperative was an invitation to disaster. Somewhere in those hours, with the noose tightening, Philby faced the most consequential private calculation of his life. He could remain and face the slow machinery of British justice, exposure, and the destruction of what was left of his name. He could perhaps cling to technicalities and secrets. He could perhaps avoid a dramatic trial. But the world would know. The carefully tailored persona, the loyal English servant of crown and country, would be stripped away before history. Or he could flee, not into freedom exactly, but into another kind of prison, the Soviet embrace he had served for so long without ever fully joining in public. Think of the psychological violence of that decision. For years, Philby had worked in Britain's institutions, spoken its language of honor and duty, enjoyed its clubs, friendships, and professional esteem. He had betrayed Britain, yes, but he had also inhabited it deeply. To escape now into the Soviet Union was not merely to save himself. It was to surrender forever the landscape in which he had built his identity. It meant crossing not just a border, but a mirror. Once gone, he would no longer be the hidden traitor inside the English house. He would be what he had always secretly been. And there are men who can endure exposure more easily than self-recognition. The final days moved with the terrible calm that often precedes disappearance. There were social obligations, meals, conversations, domestic routines. A wife who did not yet know what shape the ending would take. Friends who could still greet him without imagining that they were speaking to a man about to vanish from their world. Such ordinary details make espionage stories more haunting, not less. The last dinner plan, the household object left behind, the unfinished drink, a pair of reading glasses forgotten in haste. History remembers the headlines. Human life remembers the small, abandoned things. Then, in January 1963, Kim Philby slipped away. He left Beirut under cover of night and boarded a Soviet vessel. The sea that had so often served as backdrop to his final years became his road into exile. There is something almost mythic in that image, a traitor departing by ship into darkness. But myth should not soften the reality. This was not a triumphant extraction under banners. It was the furtive exit of a compromised man who could no longer stand where he was. Behind him, he left his wife, his social world, the ruins of his credibility, and the country he had spent a lifetime betraying while dressed in its confidence. When the news broke, Britain was forced at last to confront the enormity of what had happened. Not merely that Philby had fled, not merely that the elusive third man had turned out to be real, but that one of the most painful suspicions in the modern history of British intelligence had been true all along. He had been there, inside the rooms where secrets were weighed and operations conceived. He had been trusted after warning signs, defended after doubt, rehabilitated after scandal. The national humiliation was not abstract. It cut through institutions, friendships, and the mythology of British competence. To grasp the depth of the wound, you must remember what intelligence services depend upon beyond tradecraft. They depend on confidence. Confidence between allies. Confidence inside offices. Confidence that the person across the desk is what he seems to be. Philby's betrayal did not just leak information, it corroded this deeper substance. After him, every friendship could look like a vulnerability. Every public school accent could sound like camouflage. Every smooth career could conceal another catastrophe. Once a man like Philby is uncovered, the damage continues long after the files are closed because suspicion becomes a culture. And then there was the blood and ruin carried in his wake. Some of the cost can never be neatly counted. Intelligence services love summaries. Names, dates, files compromised, sources lost, operations penetrated. But what cannot be fully enumerated is the atmosphere of fear that follows betrayal. The prisoners taken because an adversary was ready for them. The networks rolled up because warning arrived too soon in Moscow. The men and women whose usefulness ended in a cell or against a wall because Philby had passed what he knew. In Albania and elsewhere, anti-communist efforts were broken or blunted. In countless cases, the line between his information and another person's suffering ran straight, even when historians still argue over the precise chain of causation. Such debates matter to scholars, and they should. Precision is an act of respect toward the dead. But there is also a broader truth beyond any single disputed document. Philby served the Soviet services for decades from positions of exceptional access. People suffered because of what he gave them. The hidden war was never bloodless. It only hid the blood more effectively. And what of the man himself once he reached Moscow? If you imagine applause, medals, and immediate glory, erase the image. The reality was colder. Moscow had long prized him as a penetration agent of extraordinary value, but intelligence services are incapable of pure gratitude. They use, they suspect, they archive. When a mole finally arrives in the state he has served from afar, he often discovers a painful truth. He is no longer most valuable for what he has done. He is now valuable only for what else he might still provide. Once his access ends, the romance thins. Philby entered Soviet life not as a conquering hero in full command of his destiny, but as a displaced asset under scrutiny. For years, he lived in a haze of disillusion, heavy drinking, and diminished importance. He had escaped prosecution, but not judgment. Not Britain's judgment now, a harsher one. The judgment of reality. The cause to which he had sacrificed his public identity did not greet him with warmth equal to his fantasies. The Soviet system was bureaucratic, suspicious, impersonal, and often cruel in ways Western idealists had once romanticized into abstraction. Consider the emotional irony. He had betrayed flesh and blood relationships in Britain for a political faith that, upon arrival, offered him little comfort. He was useful. He was famous in a narrow, classified sense. He could lecture younger officers, analyze Western methods, recount old operations, contribute to memoir and mythology. But the central drama of his life was over. The mask had fused to the face for so long that once removed, he was not liberated. He was reduced. There are reports from those Moscow years of loneliness, alcoholism, depression, and a man haunted not by public remorse in the ordinary sense, but by the wreckage of what he had become. That is one of the most tragic and unsettling dimensions of espionage. Great spies often destroy not only others, but the architecture of their own interior world. To live by deception over decades is to hollow out the boundary between performance and self. In the end, what remains? A doctrine, a few medals, a file, a ruined marriage, a room in a foreign capital, memories that cannot be spoken honestly even to oneself. And yet the story does not end with his private exile. Because every betrayal of this scale radiates outward through the lives of those left behind. Think first of his wife in Beirut, learning that the husband she knew, or thought she knew, had vanished into the night toward the Soviet Union. Imagine the practical shock before the historical one, the hours of confusion, the unanswered questions, the dawning realization that the marriage had contained corridors she had never seen. This is how espionage punishes the innocent, not only through widowhood or imprisonment, but through retrospective contamination. Every shared memory is suddenly suspect. Was that trip genuine? Was that mood about work or about fear? Was that silence ordinary male reserve or operational concealment? The past is poisoned one recollection at a time. Then think of the friends. Men who had hunted with him, dined with him, argued politics with him, laughed at the same jokes. Some must have felt anger so deep it approached humiliation. Others perhaps felt something worse. Shame at having loved him, shame at not having seen him, shame at the realization that the very qualities they admired had been part of the mechanism that deceived them. Betrayal by a stranger wounds pride. Betrayal by a friend wounds identity. British intelligence itself had to undergo a bitter internal reckoning. Procedures changed, vetting deepened. The old reliance on class comfort and personal recommendation no longer looked like civilized confidence. It looked like an open gate. Philby did not single-handedly transform British security culture, but he stands as one of the reasons it had to change. He became a permanent warning against the seductions of familiarity, against mistaking social ease for loyalty, against believing that treason always speaks with a foreign accent or arrives in shabby clothes. Among Allied services, particularly in the United States, the damage to trust was profound. The Cold War was built on liaison, on shared assessments and mutual vulnerability. The discovery that Britain had harbored such a penetrator in so sensitive a role fueled years of suspicion. Intelligence relationships survive embarrassment, but they do not forget it. Philby's shadow stretched across Atlantic conversations long after he was gone. Every withheld detail, every compartmented operation, every quiet American doubt about British security carried some memory of his success. There is another layer to his legacy, one more difficult and more uncomfortable. Philby became, in certain circles, almost glamorous. The urbane traitor, the perfect mole, the grand deceiver who outwitted empires. Popular culture has a dangerous habit of polishing monsters into legends. It admires composure, style, audacity. It confuses moral emptiness with sophistication. Listeners, resist that temptation. The true measure of Philby is not his cleverness. It is the damage cleverness was used to inflict. Espionage can be dramatic, yes. It can be elegant in method. But elegance in the service of betrayal is still betrayal. What, then, drove him to the end? Conviction? Vanity? Habit? A genuine belief that communism represented history's necessary future. A thrill in deceit. Perhaps all of these, braided together until even he could not fully separate one from the other. Human beings prefer a single motive because it feels tidy. Real lives are rarely tidy. Philby may well have begun with ideological fire. Over time, the role itself may have become indispensable to him. He was the man in the middle, the trusted one, the untouchable one, the insider who knew what others did not know. To stop would have been to become ordinary, and ordinary may have terrified him more than danger. The years passed. His status in Moscow improved somewhat in later life. Honors came, recognition came. The Soviet state eventually wrapped him in the ceremonial respect reserved for one of its great foreign servants. But ceremonies do not repair souls. They cannot restore abandoned marriages, or resurrect compromised agents, or erase the suspicion that the homeland you chose never quite embraced you as fully as the homeland you betrayed once did. He died in Moscow in 1988, far from the English world whose codes he had exploited so perfectly. What remains now is not merely the biography of one double agent, but a lesson cut into the hidden history of the 20th century. It is a lesson about institutions, that they are weakest where they are most self-satisfied, that prejudice can masquerade as discernment, that systems built on old boy trust create blind spots wide enough for catastrophe. It is a lesson about ideology, that moral certainty, when mixed with secrecy and arrogance, can justify almost any act. It is a lesson about espionage itself, that the most devastating spy is not always the man who steals the most documents, but the man who makes honest people doubt their own instincts for years. And perhaps above all, it is a lesson about the human cost of living divided. The spy story is often told as a contest of wits, a chess game in dim rooms. But beneath the cleverness lies something sadder. To become a successful long-term traitor, a man must amputate parts of himself and call the wound a mission. He must train his face to lie without trembling. He must let others love a fabrication. He must bury the ordinary consolations of truth so deeply that in the end, he may no longer know whether anything within him is untouched by performance. That is why the Philby story endures. Not because he was admirable, not because he was romantic, but because he embodies a terrifying possibility that a polished, intelligent, cultured man can move through the very center of national life while serving its enemy, and that for years, the thing protecting him most effectively is not the brilliance of his tradecraft alone, but the reluctance of decent people to believe that charm and treason can inhabit the same body. When I think of Kim Philby, I do not think first of Moscow or Cambridge or even the secret files.
I think of thresholds. The threshold of that Beirut apartment. The threshold between confession and flight. The threshold crossed by every friend who invited him in, never knowing whom they were really welcoming. A life spent on thresholds, always between two worlds, never wholly belonging to either, until at last the doors closed and he was left with the consequences of his own design. Somewhere in the long, dark archive of the Cold War, his name still moves like a stain. Not because he was the only traitor, history has many, but because he understood so completely how trust works, how institutions reassure themselves, how friendship disarms suspicion, how class can be worn like an invisibility cloak. He taught future services what a penetration agent can do. He taught them, too late for many, that the enemy may arrive with perfect manners. And perhaps that is the final chill in this story. The greatest danger is not always the obvious adversary at the gate. Sometimes it is the companion at the table, the colleague in the corridor, the familiar voice on the telephone, the man who knows the hymns, the jokes, the schools,
the little rituals by which a tribe recognizes its own. By the time such a man is exposed, the damage is already woven into memory. Our story ends here for today. Thank you for listening. If you found value in this journey into the past, please share this story, leave a like, and subscribe. Until next time, stay safe and remember, history is often made in the shadows.